Mississippi, deep in the cotton harvest of the 19th century, endless fields of white stretch to the horizon, but beneath the shimmer lies sweat, blood, and silence. Overseers' whips slice the air like thunder, cracking over bent backs that measure time by pain. Among them stands Ned, quiet for years, scars carved across his skin like an unspoken diary. Tonight, he does not know if he will live, but he knows one thing: if that whip lashes down again, it will not return to its master's hand. The fields stretched wider than the eye could hold, a living ocean of white cotton swaying in the late summer heat. To outsiders, the sight looked almost beautiful, like snow drifting across the Mississippi countryside. But for the men and women bent double beneath that sun, there was nothing beautiful here. Each tuft of cotton was a thorn in the hand, each stalk another demand on the body already worn thin. Ned's fingers moved without thought, plucking the white, stuffing it into the long sack, dragging against his back. The canvas rubbed his shoulders raw, but he did not wince. Pain was a language he had long since stopped answering. Around him, rows of men and women moved in the same rhythm, their backs bent like broken branches, their breaths shallow and measured. Time did not move by the clock, it moved by the overseer's orders, and the tally of pounds weighed at dusk. The sun punished every inch of bare skin, sweat stung eyes, and the air hung heavy with dust. The harvest was supposed to bring prosperity, but it never belonged to the hands that labored. For Ned and the others, harvest meant longer hours, fewer breaks, and the ever-present lash waiting to strike. He glanced sideways at the boy 2 rows down, hardly more than a child, dragging a sack too large for his shoulders. The boy's lips were cracked, his movements sluggish. Ned looked away before the overseer noticed his glance. Compassion was dangerous when eyes were always watching. The whip cracked behind him, sharp as lightning. A woman stumbled, her sack spilling cotton into the dirt. The overseer's voice rose, snarling like a dog. "Pick it up, faster!" The woman's hands shook as she scrambled, her face tight with fear. The cotton lay speckled with red where her skin had torn. Ned bent lower and kept moving. Every blow that fell on another's back reverberated inside his own. The scars across his shoulders told his story better than words ever could. The overseer thought silence meant submission, but silence also meant listening, waiting, holding something deep where it could not be taken. The fields of white held more than cotton. They held the invisible fire of men and women driven past breaking, each drop of blood soaked into the earth, staining roots that would never tell the truth. Cotton looked like purity from afar, but Ned knew better. It was a crop watered by sweat, fertilized with pain, and harvested under fire. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the rows, Ned's eyes lifted from the plants. For just a second, he stared at the horizon. The world seemed endless, yet his life was trapped within these borders. Still, something in that sky stirred like a whisper of freedom, faint but not extinguished. The overseer was a man whose presence alone bent the field. He did not carry books, nor prayers, nor promises, only a whip coiled at his side. For him, the whip was not punishment, it was language. Each crack was a command, each welt a period, each scream an exclamation point. His name hardly mattered. On the plantation, he was not remembered as a man but as a shadow, long and merciless. He wore a broad hat that kept the sun off his pale face, his boots pressing prints deep into the soil, marks that seemed to brand the ground itself. Whenever he appeared, conversation stopped. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Ned had felt the lash more times than he could count. Some were for dropping cotton too slowly, others for standing too straight, still others for no reason at all. The scars that ran across his back had healed into ridges, pale rivers that carried memory without voice. He never cried out. His silence infuriated the overseer, who wanted fear made audible, pain displayed. Ned gave him nothing. At night, when Ned returned to the cabin, his shirt clinging to the raw flesh beneath, he would sit in the corner and trace one scar with his fingertip. Each line was like a carved inscription on a tombstone yet to be raised. It was as if the overseer wrote his name across Ned's body, but Ned refused to let those marks be the final story. The overseer ruled not just with force but with spectacle. Beatings were performed publicly, before the field hands, a theater of terror staged to remind them all of what resistance cost. Children learned the meaning of power not from sermons, but from screams. Women picked cotton with eyes averted, praying not to be noticed. Men bent lower, carrying not just their sacks but the weight of humiliation. Still, power is a fragile thing, built on the illusion of invincibility. The overseer believed himself untouchable. He believed that every man and woman in the field had been broken into silence. He believed that fear would always outweigh courage. Ned watched him more closely than he let on. He saw the rhythm of his patrols, the moments when the whip rested at his side, the careless arrogance that made him certain he was safe. Each scar on Ned's back was an entry in a silent ledger, and that ledger was filling to the brim. In the overseer's shadow, life was measured in lashes, but shadows lengthen when the sun begins to fall. And Ned, though quiet, was already measuring something else, something the overseer had never accounted for, the exact point where silence would no longer hold. Night on the plantation did not mean rest. It meant whispers carried carefully through wooden walls, a chorus of fears muffled before they could form words. The cabins stood close together, rows of weathered timber that smelled of smoke and sweat, yet each one held a silence that felt heavier than chains. Ned sat in the corner of his cabin, the glow of the dying fire painting his face in shadows. Around him, a few men murmured in low voices, their sentences cut short whenever the floorboards creaked or the wind shifted. Even here, freedom of speech was a luxury they could not afford. The overseer's ears seemed to stretch into the night. Walls felt thinner when punishment could come at dawn. He ran a hand across the ridges of his back. The scars were maps, but not of places, maps of survival. Each welt remembered a moment when he had wanted to cry out but chose silence instead. Silence had kept him alive. Silence had let him keep something no whip could reach. But silence carried its own weight. It pressed down like a stone on his chest, made his breaths shallow, made his nights long. Outside, cicadas sang relentlessly, their hum almost like a warning. Ned stared at the gap in the wooden planks where moonlight leaked through. Beyond that thin barrier, the world waited. He wondered if it would ever open for him, or if he would die behind walls that reeked of smoke and fear. In another corner, an old man whispered a prayer, words so faint they sounded more like wind than voice. A woman rocked her child, humming softly, trying to weave a cocoon of calm in a place where calm never lasted. The air itself was fragile, as though one wrong word could shatter it into pieces. Ned's mind wandered to the boy he had seen struggling in the field. He thought of the whip curling through the air, the sound of it breaking flesh. The image replayed in his mind like a flame flickering in ash. Each time it appeared, he felt something stir deep inside him. Not rage, not yet just a spark, hidden but alive. Silence had been his shield, but now it felt like a cage. He realized that silence could protect, but it could also suffocate. And in that dim cabin, where the only light came from the moon spilling across the dirt floor, Ned felt a shift. It was as small as the tremor of a leaf in the wind, but he recognized it. He was no longer content to be silent. The weight pressed too heavily now. The ledger of scars was too full. Somewhere inside, the ember of defiance glowed. The next day, the sun rose merciless, spilling fire across the horizon. Harvest season was reaching its peak, and the demands grew harsher with each passing hour. Overseers pushed harder, barking orders, the crack of whips louder and more frequent than ever. Cotton must be gathered before storms, before rot, before the market window closed. The pressure fell not on the plantation owners but on the backs of those bent double in the fields. The air shimmered with heat. Cotton bolls tore at fingers already raw. Shirts clung to bodies soaked in sweat. Salt stinging wounds that had never healed. The earth gave off a smell of dust and fatigue. Time dragged, marked by the overseer's voice. Faster, faster. Every second stretched, each minute an eternity of labor. Ned moved like the others, but today something felt different. His body strained against exhaustion, yet his eyes no longer stayed fixed on the ground. For years, he had avoided looking up, kept his gaze low, safe, invisible. But the heat, the constant blows of the whip, the endless demands, they pulled his eyes toward the sky, as if asking a question he had long avoided. Above, the sky was vast, cloudless, merciless, and yet, staring into that endless blue, Ned felt something strange. Not despair, but clarity. If there was no mercy here, then perhaps mercy had to be made. The overseer's voice roared again. A whip cracked, not at Ned this time, but close enough for the sound to burn in his ears. He did not flinch. His shoulders rose, chest expanding, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe fully. The air scorched his lungs, but it also filled him with strength. Around him, the rhythm of picking cotton continued, sacks filling, bodies sagging. But Ned's rhythm slowed, shifted. His hands still moved, but his mind was elsewhere, on the scars, on the silence, on the ember he had felt the night before. He could almost hear it now, crackling faintly beneath the roar of the overseer's commands. As the day wore on, the sun sank lower, yet the heat did not relent. Bodies collapsed, dragged upright again. Whips snapped, curses flew. In the haze of sweat and dust, Ned lifted his head once more, his eyes locked not on the cotton, not on the ground, but on the horizon. For the first time, he was no longer looking down, and in that single act, invisible to most, something irreversible began to shift. The sky grew heavy with clouds that afternoon, a strange gloom rolling across the fields, though the sun had not yet set. The air thickened, pressing on lungs, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Every worker in the row could feel it. Cotton still needed to be picked, sacks still needed to be filled, but something in the air made the simple act of bending and plucking feel unbearable. The overseer prowled like a wolf, his boots pounding the soil, his whip twitching in his hand. He barked at the older men, spat insults at the women, lashed the backs of those who stumbled. The cotton field, once only a place of toil, now became a stage for cruelty. Ned kept his hands moving, though his shoulders screamed with pain. His eyes followed the boy beside him, a boy with a face still soft, hair curling at his temples, his sack nearly dragging him into the dirt. The overseer had taken notice too. He stalked forward, whip uncoiling. The boy dropped a bowl of cotton, just one, and froze. That was all it took. The overseer's shadow fell across him, voice rising in fury. "Pick it up, faster, you worthless dog." The boy scrambled, his fingers trembling, but the whip was already in motion. The crack split the field like lightning. The boy gasped, cotton scattering across the ground. Blood bloomed against the white tufts, a violent red that seemed louder than any scream. Ned's body stiffened, his hands stopped. He felt something tear inside him, not flesh, but silence itself, ripped open at last. For years, he had watched, endured, bent low under pain that was not only his own. But now, staring at the boy's broken figure, he felt the string that had held him taut finally snap. His chest rose and fell like a storm-gathering force, his eyes, once trained to the ground, fixed on the overseer. Around him, the field stilled. No one dared breathe. The wind itself quieted, as if the earth wanted to see what would happen next. Above, the clouds thickened. A hawk circled in the distance, its wings stretched wide. Ned's hands trembled, not with fear, but with something sharper, heavier, unstoppable. The boy whimpered beside him, and the overseer lifted his whip again, hungry for another strike. Ned felt his muscles coil like a bowstring pulled too tight. The world shrank to a single line, the whip in the overseer's hand and the fire in his own chest. The moment had come. The silence of years could no longer contain the sound waiting to be born. The whip rose, the sky darkened. Time seemed to stretch so thin it almost tore. Ned's breath caught in his throat as the overseer's arm arced downward, a gesture he had seen 1,000 times before. But this time, something broke the pattern. His hand closed around the steel handle of the cotton-picking knife. It was not a weapon of war, only a tool meant for the harvest. Yet in that instant, it became something else entirely. There was no plan, no signal, no whispered agreement. It happened as naturally as breathing after drowning. The blade left his side in a blur of motion, and the air itself seemed to shatter. A sound erupted, not the crack of the whip, but another, deeper noise. A grunt, a cry, a silence folding in on itself. Workers froze mid-motion, their hands clutching cotton that suddenly felt heavier than stone. The overseer staggered, his voice cut short. The whip slipped from his hand, falling soundlessly into the dirt. Dust lifted around his boots, then stilled. The field was utterly silent. Even the cicadas paused, as if the natural world itself recoiled. Ned stood, chest heaving, the knife still clenched in his grip. His eyes burned not with triumph, but with something raw release, defiance, the first taste of a voice long buried. No one spoke, no one moved. Men and women who had known only submission stared at Ned as though seeing him for the first time. Some trembled, others held their breath, but all recognized what had just happened. The cotton swayed gently in the wind, brushing against knees and ankles. whispering like 1,000 witnesses. A patch of white near the overseer's feet bore the faint mark of red, staining purity with truth. Ned dropped his gaze to the boy, still crouched in the dirt, eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time, Ned bent not to the cotton, but to another human being. He helped the boy to his feet, steadying him with a hand as strong as iron. The overseer lay still. The whip was gone from his grasp. The balance of power had shifted, however briefly, however dangerously. And in that moment, with every worker's eyes fixed on him, Ned stood taller than he had in all his years. His silence had ended, not in words, but in action. The field would never forget the sound it heard that day. Not a scream, not a command, but a break, clean, final, and impossible to undo. The moment hung in the air like a storm refusing to break. Every worker froze, sacks half-filled, hands suspended above cotton plants. The overseer's body slumped into the dirt, the whip lying lifeless beside him. A silence deeper than night fell across the rows, pressing on every chest. Ned stood in the center, chest heaving, knife still gripped tight, though his knuckles had turned white. His breathing was loud in his ears, louder than the cicadas, louder than the wind that stirred the cotton. For years, he had kept his head bowed, his voice locked inside. Now, he stood taller than he ever had, eyes burning, shoulders squared. The boy beside him trembled, staring first at the overseer, then at Ned. Slowly, Ned reached out, steadying the boy with a hand on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but in it lay something unspoken: reassurance, courage, defiance. Around them, others dared to lift their heads. Eyes met, wide with fear but also with something else: recognition. They saw not just what had happened, but what it meant. For the first time, someone had broken the unbreakable. The overseer's shadow no longer covered the field. And yet, the silence carried weight. It was not celebration, not yet. It was dread. Every man and woman there knew the cost of defiance. They knew how quickly word would spread, how swiftly the owners would strike back. Ned's act was a spark, but sparks could burn everything, and fire never spared the ones who lit it. Still, the cotton swayed, whispering like a witness. The white fields had drunk blood before, but never like this. The earth itself seemed to remember, etching the moment into soil and root. Ned dropped the knife into the dirt. He lifted his chin, his eyes sweeping across the field. No words passed his lips, there was no need. His silence spoke more than any speech could. He was no longer bent, no longer broken. He stood as a man, if only for that brief, suspended moment. The whip, symbol of control, lay abandoned. The overseer's shadow was gone. What replaced it was fragile, trembling, but real. The image of a man reclaiming his dignity in the open air. The silence stretched longer, unbearable, as though the field itself was holding its breath. Then, somewhere far off, a dog barked. The spell broke. The world would move again, and with it, the consequences would come. Word spread like wildfire. By dusk, whispers had carried from the cotton rows to the big house, from the cabins to the nearest town. The overseer was dead. And Ned, the quiet one, the one who never raised his voice, was the man who had done it. The hunt began before night fully fell. Riders mounted with lanterns and dogs poured into the fields. The plantation owners knew rebellion must be crushed quickly, before courage spread like a plague. Ned did not wait. He ran, through cotton rows, across muddy paths, into the dense marshlands that bordered the plantation. His feet pounded the earth, his breath tearing through his chest. Behind him, dogs howled, men shouted, lanterns bobbed like angry fireflies in the dark. The swamp swallowed him in shadows. Mud clung to his legs, water splashed against his knees. He pressed forward, guided only by instinct, by the need to keep moving. Each footprint sank deep, leaving behind evidence, but there was no choice. The reeds rattled, frogs croaked, and the night grew thick around him. Every step was a battle. He stumbled, caught himself, stumbled again. The weight of silence no longer pressed on him, it was replaced by the weight of pursuit. He was not just running for himself now. He was running for the boy he had saved, for every pair of eyes that had watched him stand tall in the field. Behind him, voices grew louder. The hunters fanned out, dogs sniffing at the ground, splashing through water. Ned waded deeper, his chest rising and falling like thunder. He pushed through vines, scraped against branches, blood mixing with sweat. For a moment, the marsh seemed endless, a labyrinth of darkness and water that might hide him forever. He dared to hope. He dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could vanish into the wilderness, become a ghost the plantation could never reclaim. But hope is fragile. The dogs closed in. Torches flared through the trees. Men shouted, the sound of boots slapping against wet ground closing around him. Ned turned once, his breath sharp in his throat, and saw the circle tightening. Lanterns glowed in every direction, their light reflected in the water like cruel stars. There was nowhere left to run. His chest heaved, his hands clenched, but his eyes burned steady. They had chased his body, but they could not catch his defiance. And when the men surged forward, seizing him, dragging him to the ground, Ned did not cry out. He met the night with silence, the same silence that had been his shield, now his final weapon. Morning came cold and gray, the kind of sky that offered no comfort. Ned was dragged into town with wrists bound, his clothes torn from the chase through the marsh. Dirt streaked his face, his body bruised, but his back remained straight. He did not lower his gaze, even as townsfolk crowded the street to watch him pass. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some horrified, some curious, some secretly awed. The courthouse was small, its wooden walls echoing with footsteps as guards shoved him inside. He stood before a bench where men in coats and polished boots presided, their voices crisp, their verdict already written before the trial began. The proceedings were swift, witnesses were called, words twisted into condemnation. The boy Ned had protected was nowhere to be seen. No one from the fields was allowed to speak. Ned himself was not asked to explain, not asked to confess, not even asked to deny. His silence, once his refuge, was now taken as guilt. The prosecutor's voice rang out like a sermon. This man, by his hand, has destroyed order. By his example, he threatens the very foundation of our society. His act cannot be forgiven, cannot be excused. The sentence must be death, and it must be public. There was no jury of peers, there was no mercy. The gavel struck wood, sharp and final. Ned was condemned to hang at dawn. As the room emptied, he remained where he stood, the chains cold around his wrists. Guards pulled him away, shoving him into a cell with stone walls damp from the night. The air smelled of iron and mildew. He sat on the wooden floor, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the faint square of sky visible through a barred window. His thoughts wandered not to fear, but to memory. He saw again the boy in the field, blood dripping onto cotton. He saw the whip falling, the silence breaking, the field holding its breath. He knew what his fate would be, but he also knew something the court did not. Silence could be broken, and once broken, it could not be undone. When dawn came, the square was filled. A scaffold loomed tall against the pale sky, ropes swaying in the wind. The crowd gathered, eager for spectacle, for reassurance that order would be restored. Ned walked forward, unflinching. His steps were steady, his shoulders squared. He carried no words, no plea. His silence was his last defiance, and in that silence, he was louder than the jeers around him. The noose tightened, the world held still, and when the trapdoor opened, the silence thundered louder than any sound the overseer's whip had ever made. Years passed. The plantation fields continued to bloom white each season, but the soil remembered more than cotton. It remembered footsteps pounding through rows, blood soaking into dirt, a silence that once shattered like glass. Though overseers changed and whips cracked again, the story of Ned lingered past in whispers among those who still bent low beneath the Sunday. They spoke of him quietly, at night in cabins, around dying fires. Not as a hero, they were too cautious for that word, but as a man who had stood when no one else could. A man who had lifted his head and broken the rhythm of obedience. To some, his act was madness. To others, it was proof that courage could survive even in chains. Children grew up hearing fragments of his name, though they were warned never to repeat it outside safe walls. His deed was forbidden memory, yet memory has a way of surviving in songs, in prayers, in the pauses between words. Ned became more than one man. He became a question. Was he guilty of murder, as the court had declared, or was he guilty only of reclaiming what had been stolen, his voice, his dignity, his humanity? The answer shifted depending on who asked, but the question itself endured. The fields of Mississippi bore witness long after the men with whips were gone. Cotton still swayed, white against the sky, but in every harvest, some saw red beneath the stalks. Imagine the silence that once roared louder than any shout. History did not write Ned's name in books. It preferred kings, generals, and owners, but names like his breathed in other ways, in the courage of those who heard, in the defiance of those who remembered. His story traveled not on paper, but on breath. And now, when we tell it, we return him to the world he was denied. His silence, once forced, becomes a voice that still echoes, in every question of justice, in every cry against cruelty, in every reminder that one act of defiance can change the weight of an entire field. Ned's life ended on the gallows, but his story refused to end there. It lives in the soil, in the scars of memory, in the whisper of cotton under the wind. And so we ask, was it a crime, or was it freedom? Was it destruction, or the first breath of dignity? If stories like Ned's speak to you, subscribe to Murder Files Television, because names like his still breathe when we say them out loud.